All right, our next speaker is Susan Athey talking about AI, competition, and welfare.
All right, thanks so much for having me here. This has been such a fun couple of days. So you might think I'm too old to get nervous before talks, but I am nervous before this talk because I actually didn't take very much macro in graduate school, and I had never solved the general equilibrium model before this summer. So be gentle with me. I actually made this slide like 15 years ago, and I actually haven't changed it very much. Because I've been going to talks and panels and discussions about what's the impact of machine learning and digitization and AI on the economy. And one thing that makes this very hard is there's just so many feedback effects. Now, I think after COVID, I don't have to talk on the details of this slide as much because we all saw so many feedback effects, and we also were somewhat surprised about some things moved quickly, like we could reallocate the location of white-collar workers very fast, but other bottlenecks we didn't expect appeared. And sometimes we see that it's like just one bottleneck. If I can't get the chip for the car, there are no cars, and the prices of cars go up by $10,000, and people are sad. And containers and things. So there's a lot of these feedback effects where when you have a bigger change like the transformative change in AI we're talking about, we really do need to think through these things. And one way to do this is to talk about scenarios. And that's something that we did in an earlier conference this week, which I think is really helpful because otherwise just doing tweaks around the edges of your current state just doesn't get you there. Now, those pictures, though, we tend to, in economics, mostly reason about them in a static cross-sectional sense, and we look for an equilibrium because it's too hard to do all the dynamics. Another observation I have, and that I've been making in a lot of these arguments, is that we really have to think about the relative timing of changes, and some things move fast and some things move slow. So like if we're going to get to the point where we're on the beach with drones dropping us daiquiris, we do need to think about whether it's even possible to get there because something might have moved fast and something else might have moved slow and we just can't get there. And so there's no political economy on this slide. That's actually one of the things I might focus on if I was just thinking about that. But even just focusing on the pure economics, we have these disruptions, these societal changes. We have prices and wages, inflation. We have restructuring of production. We have focused labor market disruptions. And some of those things happen very fast. But then other things like increased or improved government services, more nurses, more teachers, labor augmentation, competition policy, transition policies for workers. We've never been good at that. Why are we going to, and the idea that we're going to do it really fast now sounds a little bit unlikely. So, but when I think about all of these things and what to talk about, one thing in many of the panels and discussions and conferences I go to, people are really not focused on competition policy and its implications. So today I want to just highlight things that we already know, but we somehow keep leaving them out of our models and analyses. And so I want to kind of bring them to the forefront. So some people say, well, why are you worried about competition in AI? It looks pretty competitive. It's more competitive than phones or search engines. That's great, but like search engines look pretty competitive for a while, and so did phones. And so you have to really think about like why those were not competitive over a long period of time. Spending a couple of years in doing full-time antitrust, you see across the whole economy, an industry can sound competitive, but then somewhere somebody's got a bottleneck, whether it's a poultry processing facility or something else, and whoever's got that bottleneck takes a big margin. They also tend to extract above and below them in the value chain. So like, here maybe chips, maybe that's getting relaxed, but like chips can slow down the whole thing and create costs for the whole thing if they have market power. And whoever has market power also finds a way to figure out how to hang on to it in very, very, very clever ways because there's a lot at stake to doing that. Here's just like one possible vision of a future. When I do this longer, I have like multiple visions. This isn't actually the one I think is most likely, but just, things may feel competitive now, but like if AI and agents get very big, that might like take over the phone. And Google is going to be the one who sees your email and your location and has all the 3 million advertisers signed up, and Google products and so on. So why would they like let other people play as nicely with on their phone? And so you might have a Google ecosystem with your home, your thermostats, everything else. If somehow ChatGPT and Apple managed to get along over a long innovative period, there could be a ChatGPT ecosystem on top of the iPhone, or maybe OpenAI buys Apple or something else, but there's another one of these. And there's a whole ChatGPT ecosystem. Say, oh great, there's a duopoly. But that's not always great. On the enterprise, it is a lot harder to get to monopoly on the enterprise, but you can imagine a world where there's an enterprise assistant that takes over a lot of stuff, even though other people continue to exist. So, oligopoly doesn't seem crazy, and if the whole economy is building on top of this stuff, that's like a tax on the economy. So what I want to talk about today is, this is sort of a summary of the ideas. Labor-saving AI adoption increases welfare broadly if consumer prices fall alongside wages, and if workers, and it won't be too bad distributionally, if workers are sufficiently productive in alternative sectors where AI is less substitutive, or where AI augments rather than replaces them. And of course, governments and university research can affect whether AI augments rather than replaces them. A second key point is that, and I'm working with the World Bank on their Global Development Report for 2026 on AI, and I've been thinking a lot about developing countries. Many countries will import AI, and more broadly, even if you're the US, profits may accrue to a small number of individuals or firms, and that might not lead to broad distribution and the macroeconomic feedback effects that we'd be looking for. So one insight I have is that people have been building a lot of closed economy task allocation models about automation, but actually a GE model with an imported factor of production may be a better model for many countries, or even a country that is participating in the value chain if it's concentrated and they manage to evade taxation or have political power. The simplest GE models, though, of this type emphasize mechanisms that aren't a good fit for AI. And so we suggest focusing on more realistic assumptions to highlight the key trade-offs from AI that should be in those models. And then a key point, one thing we want to really introduce, and the trade models help us with that, is that upstream market power for AI is going to affect wages, prices, industry structure, and distribution. And in a trade model, it's very easy to just see this getting sucked out of your country. And also, these high AI input prices put a wedge between the prices of goods and the labor input costs, which can allow aggregate welfare losses for all groups in a country, as well as even more focused harm on displaced groups whose labor is displaced. So competition policy, as well as policy-bound transitions, determines whether this is good or bad. So the way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to talk briefly about two benchmark macro models. I'm going to talk about some of the effects that I think are robust and are the ones worth focusing on, and also highlight some that I think are present in normal models but may not be the ones worth focusing on. So in particular, when AI comes in, it's going to shift productivity. Now, usually you look at local effects, like in tariff policy, you're looking at some group is replaced, and so actually you want to put on a tariff to help that group. One of the things I want to highlight here is that when you get these bigger changes, you may have kind of lumpy shifts in the sectoral skill bias, in the sense that you might displace unskilled workers and then displace skilled workers, or vice versa. So those bigger changes can lead to, in principle, more double whammies on displaced groups. They can be bad, they can be hurt by AI, and they could be hurt by tariffs, and they would also be hurt by market power. It's not always, but it's possible. The second point is we have a benchmark model with one non-traded good, and we think about the common things that happen there in the literature are that one sector gets more productive, and the problem is they're sucking in all the resources, they're sucking in all the labor. But that's not what we think is going to happen with AI, and so those macro benefits and costs kind of change. So then that leads us to our main model, which is also flawed, and it still has some of the bad, like the bad assumptions of the basic models, but it does at least allow us to isolate, I think, the things we're talking about in these rooms. We're gonna have discrete choice to automate, and then when an AI monopolist raises their price, which would be like a tariff or something that normally would protect the displaced workers, because you've just automated them all together, it doesn't bring them back in. So you can expand a sector without sucking labor back into it, and that's going to leave the displaced workers in more of a bind. The second thing is that with like sort of thinking about like a discrete technology adoption, the AI monopolist has some room to play with, and they can really suck out the profits of an industry, which actually can restructure the industry. And so if you think about AI as an input, if that has market power, we don't just get higher prices, we get less innovation, less variety, and so on. So that's another problem. If you're like an importing country and this GPT is supposed to come along, it's not going to have the effects you want it to have. Okay, so that is basically what we're going to say in a nutshell. We'll see of how much of the formalism I get through. And I have equations on the slides, but mostly you don't need to focus on them. This is just for the people who are used to these models, so it's concrete what I'm talking about. So the first benchmark model, we have 2 traded goods, a foreign AI input. So there's fixed world prices. It's a small country. And so what really drives the impact of a fall in the cost of AI, or like, which is kind of like the introduction of AI, that's like going from autarky to trade in the trade models. What really drives things is which sector is more skill intensive. And so say unskilled workers, the impact to them from a change in price is driven entirely by whether the AI adopting sector is more skilled or unskilled. And the fact if an AI monopolist raises its price, that's always bad for the country. Okay. One of the things that we highlight though is that it's not crazy, again, if you think about a more transformative change, that like skill intensity as the input price changes could actually fluctuate. So, you know, at first AI might substitute for unskilled and then skilled and so on. So let me actually just jump here. Like this is the sort of the classic case people might think about. Imagine that as prices rise, you end up getting less skilled. So as prices fall, you get more unskilled. Then we can look at what happens to the wages of unskilled workers. And those wages will, the wages are sort of the integral under the curve. So if we go from like the entry, which is a low price, to infinity, a high price, if that integral is positive, then entry is bad for the unskilled workers. But if you're going to get that overall integral to be positive, then a little bit of an increase in the price of X actually helps the harmed party, so it restores distribution. And whichever side you're on, the party that's harmed is helped by a little bit of a raise in price. But if we have something that's more monotone from like a larger change, you could actually have the harmed party, so that's like the integral under there, could have one sign, but the marginal derivative could have another sign. And so what could happen is that the entry of AI could be bad for unskilled workers, but a monopolist raising the price of AI hurts them even more because you flipped from being skilled. It's a reversal in terms of like the techniques that you're using or the skill bias. Then if we move to the unrealistic thing about this is that you're exporting. And so when technology changes, you can just like export to the world. That seems kind of unreasonable, and there's also nothing non-traded. So a second benchmark model that people use is one where there's maybe one untraded good and one traded good. And just to kind of summarize what the macro implications, again, is very standard model, is that if you get this new factor of production that raises your productivity, your whole economy shifts into exporting B on the world market, and you pull resources into that sector, and that can raise prices in another sector. These are Baumol's mechanisms, Dutch disease mechanisms. But as I mentioned, I don't really think those are very realistic if we're thinking about something where it gets more productive, but actually you can't lean into it because like the whole world is hit by this shock. So there's not like all these people who want to buy your cheap exports, and you're not actually pulling any labor. So the classic kind of general equilibrium effects are not there. So the third model we introduce is one that has a little more richness, but it's still like a very simple, from an IO perspective, it's still like a very limited model, but it has at least a few of the main effects we might want. So we're going to allow there to have both sectors be non-traded, because that's going to be a shorthand for the fact that you can't just start exporting your way out of this, that really the marginal utility of each sector is diminishing, and that's going to limit where you can go with your newly productive sectors. And we have in the AI producing sector, we have free entry and differentiated products, so we can think about sort of welfare effects of fees. And so we have a little simple model with free entry. There's markups, and we have quantity determined in equilibrium. Crucially, the fees you pay to the monopolist will be transferred abroad, and so that's sort of, it's like a fall in your terms of trade, but you're not able to reconsume, feed those fees back into the economy. And so then the welfare ratio can be decomposed into a cost effect, and so if AI comes in and it's very cheap, then costs go down, and that's good. But if a monopolist charges you a high marginal price, then those costs don't go down, and maybe you don't get a lot of benefit domestically because the AI provider extracts the surplus, and actually you still are paying a marginal cost for labor. They have to lower it because when you've fired all the workers, the wage goes down, and so you still can't charge too much because there's all these fired workers floating around, and so people might not adopt your technology. They might just stick with the low wage workers, but still you can raise the marginal cost of this thing up to the wage of these displaced workers. And so you may not get a marginal cost benefit once you funnel through the market power. If the monopolist fee is going to be a fixed fee they charge, they can also maybe use nonlinear pricing. If they use nonlinear pricing, they're going to extract surplus that way too, so there'll be less domestic firms, your industry will be more concentrated, it'll still have scale economies and maybe more scale economies because now you have to pay this fixed fee in order to survive. Aggregate income can shift, and there can still be price effects in the non-traded good. So if you put all that together, this is formally showing that this could be great if like AI is free, as you could still have distributional problems, but aggregate it would be fine. But if you have AI expensive, you have distributional problems and aggregate problems. So let me just. I already said that verbally. Let me just jump to the monopoly part, which is the part that's technically new, although I think it's very intuitive. When we think about the pricing of a foreign AI provider, they do have to think about whether the firms will adopt. The deviation condition for a firm to adopt the AI technology or not, when there's a fixed cost of adoption, it depends on the equilibrium wages in the other sectors. And as I mentioned, those will go down if you replace them, if everybody else adopts. So the AI provider is going to figure out how to price. Generally, you're going to be on the frontier, so they're going to extract as much surplus as possible so that the firms are not tempted to use cheap labor. Then we show that you're generally going to be on the frontier. Actually, unlike a standard IO model, you'll use both a fixed fee and a marginal fee. That's because both of them feed into income, and both of them, neither of them is efficient. So it's not the case that you want low marginal cost and you just extract a fixed fee. You use both tools. And if the policymaker just tries to cap the marginal fee, they'll increase the fixed fee. And if they try to cap the fixed fee, they'll increase the marginal fee. So you really need sophisticated regulation of prices to keep things in. So just to close up with policy implications, the first point is that looking at a closed model where the profits recirculate may miss a lot of stuff, and I think many people have that in mind when they think about the problem of having a capital-intensive economy. But now let's go even farther. Like, you can't really tax it. It's very hard to tax it. It's leaving. A second thing is that this non-traded scarcity and transition and issues, if we have people moving into another sector, we need to really think about what are they going to do in that other sector? Are they productive in that other sector? And are there things we can do to make them more productive? Or can the government actually procure more of some of those sectors, like nursing and so on? And can they invest in making the workers more productive? That's going to really determine what happens, especially on the distributional side. And then industry structure and variety, this monopoly power is actually going to hurt innovation in the local economy in a whole bunch of ways. So in the simple CES framework, it's a number of varieties, but I think that all of this could be extended. So I'm out of time. I'll just mention that I'm not trying to think that this is a very different model than anything has been done before, except for like the monopoly stuff. And the effects are familiar, but I really want to focus people on the crucial importance of the market power for like the sign of the welfare outcomes, and also the crucial role for policy in like mitigating those effects. And I hope people will figure out some good workhorse models where it's just easy to incorporate those effects, so we won't just assume them away for convenience. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Susan.
Well, I wanted to say, of course, thank you to the organizers. And I want to talk about, first of all, why it is that this paper is so fantabulous. So let me let me set this up. So if you think about the mission of this conference, it's that we're told to suspend belief and believe that will be transformative AI, which is going to replace labor in far less time than we think. And we've been told to think through that. And then a natural response to that assumption is therefore to focus on how that will affect humans as suppliers of labor. And, as a result, think less about humans as consumers or people who buy stuff. But what makes this paper fantabulous is that Susan and Fiona have really worked with this idea that we have a labor replacing technology and explain to us why consumers and the way that people consume still matters, even if that is our primary assumption. So that is what makes this brilliant, and I would say very sort of cunning, to bring back competition policy into this volume. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, in this discussion, sort of say some incremental stuff about how I might slightly rewrite the paper, and then go on, as is appropriate for a discussion in a conference such as this, with my own musings on the topic. All right, so my major comment about the paper right now is that it is a paper written by exceptionally clever people for exceptionally clever people. And that's brilliant. But I'm just wondering if, maybe spelling out the purpose of the paper a little bit more simply might mean that when this volume goes out on the internet, lots more people get why it's so important. And so my thinking about this is just that it's okay to double down on the fact that this is taking a model of trade. And just, in the way that in the presentation, you have this sort of lovely stack of bullet points saying that a lot of people, ultimately in the economy, will live in a country where AI is imported, and we need to think about that. Just sort of spell out why that's important. I mean, because in some ways, you could read this paper as being the ultimate EU nightmare, right? I'm seeing really sort of nod, right? This is basically an EU nightmare of a paper. You know, a completely different audience could be, you could go into Washington and talk to a very different kind of policymaker and say, look, guys, this is the consequence if we lose to China, right? And that might play well with some other kind of policymakers. And then, of course, what Susan knows very well, and I was just so touched that she mentioned it during her talk, she's spearheading this effort at the World Bank to really think about the consequences of AI in the developing world. You know, and when we've got, say, agrarian sectors and large agricultural sectors, you know, this is so important to really think this through. And so I think just sort of spelling that out for everyone, you know, it's probably incredibly obvious to you, but just like sort of spelling it out, I think would really make the paper up front and get people to sort of work through it, right, when it becomes, you know, exceptionally clever. All right. So maybe I just sort of like basically say, we just sort of start the paper saying many countries import AI. And that sort of helps people understand why this is such an important approach. All right, so now let me, having sort of just managed to sort of dumb down the paper, but hopefully increase its audience, I wanted to give some of my own thoughts, what I thought about when I was reading it. So as Susan mentioned, you know, the main model is Model 3, and, you know, in it, she gifts our AI producer with nonlinear pricing. And, you know, and it was interesting, when you read the paper, that's talked about quite a lot in terms of its implications. You know, I thought maybe that was exciting, and then I was like, no, that's just sort of standard, you know, rent extraction. You have two-part tariffs, it's easier to extract rent. But then, you know, as I was musing about this, it made me realize the importance, in some sense, when we're trying to build these models, of thinking hard about exactly what that monetization model is going to look like. And then sort of thinking through how it enters the production function. So, you know, this is not for this paper, these are just my musings. But I was reminded, especially because we're back in Stanford, and I was going back to my PhD days taking I.O. And at that time, Tim Bresnahan was teaching I.O. and obsessed about Microsoft. And so basically, we would just have semesters of Microsoft. and that was wonderful. I learned a lot. But one of the things that always struck me is him describing how antitrust regulators at the time, when they were thinking about sort of how to encourage competition in this new world of the internet, you know, got very fixated on the browser. And then their theory about how market power is going to manifest actually was in the channel. Now, you probably most people are too young in this room to remember that browsers used to have this tab called channels. If we clicked on that, it would take us to AOL or Disney or something like that. And there was a big fixation with the idea that that was going to be the major instrument of market power, and that the browser would be able to extract very large fixed fees from content creators. And that would have some of those horrible upstream consequences of concentration that Susan was speculating about later about here. You know, when you look at the sort of findings of fact about this, you know, the actual monetization model of a lot of the internet was never mentioned. There was no talk about advertising. There was no talk about data. You know, and it's just interesting. And so then I sort of started thinking, well, given that in the internet browser era, we maybe had the wrong monetization model, and as a result, maybe looked at the wrong things. You know, what can we think about, what do we know about what monetization might look like if we want to regulate it in the future? And generally, economists, of course, we don't really like making predictions because we know we'll probably be wrong, right? So we don't like that. But what I discovered on Wednesday was this entire field of scenario planning, and where they make really precise predictions, like tables of predictions. And, you know, Susan was referencing, it was such an interesting exercise, but we were given these tables of predictions about the economy. And, you know, that sort of struck me. And this is what I wanted to just bring to the rest of the group. So the way the scenarios were presented to us is that, you know, at least we started off, I think it was a continuum of not a bad scenario, doomsday scenario. And the not so bad scenario is sort of like the somewhat typical IT economist belief that change is going to be slow, not much happens. Whereas doomsday scenario was that basically we have sort of a Mad Max, sort of like just terrible wasteland. And, you know, the way they parameterized monetization in these two scenarios was interesting. In one of them, we had a freemium model, oddly specific freemium model. And then doomsday, it was that AI monetizes personal data at unprecedented scales. Now, the first thing which is interesting to me is, honestly, they actually look quite similar to me. I've got to be honest. I look at them and I'm like, well, why are you giving away this product for free to 95% of people if you're not monetizing data? But you're not allowed to quarrel with it. So that's just what we were told. But anyway, however you take it, given that they seem similar-ish, and, you know, these are what young people were sort of thinking along the margins is going to be happening, you know, it does seem good to sort of think, well, you know, what happens if we end up in this world where actually monetization is done through data again, maybe through some kind of advertising support. You know, how will that affect all these models, right? So it's sort of got some interesting implications because it's almost, Susan, as though your model is in the good world, right, where we actually have a price. Now, it depends, you know, again, I just want to be clear. I'm not sure in a world where the actual monetization model is the monetization of data is the big problem, is going to be used various ways of interpreting it. I think what we could say is that, again, we'll be in an EU nightmare world, right, if we monetize data, and that becomes the primary engine of monetization. But we might, again, end up in a world where, like today, rich eyeballs in developed countries cross-subsidize a lot of technology for the developing world. So, it's, you know, it's interesting to think through this scenario too. All right, so that's really my big thought. Obviously, this was a terrific paper. I want to again give all credit to the authors for basically taking the scenario given in this volume, which was so focused on labor supply, and bringing it back to people as consumers and reminding us why that matters. And I think that's just a huge contribution. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.